One of the most poignant images we have depicting the poor of Victorian London is this haunting portrait of a lady sitting on a step. The hopelessness and helplessness that emanate from the photograph are truly heartrending. She leans awkwardly against the cold brick wall, her eyes downcast, her lips seeming to quiver with misery. She looks utterly exhausted and dejected. On the step beside her are the remnants of a warming cup of tea that she had enjoyed prior to the photographer arriving to capture her plight for posterity. Maybe the photographer himself bought it for her, perhaps as payment for modelling for him. On the step to her right is an old teapot that has evidently seen better days. This, as it will transpire, is or was an important tool in her daily battle for survival on the streets of London. On her lap is what at first glance appears to be a rolled-up bundle of rags, but on closer inspection it is in fact a child, albeit it is not her child, but rather a baby she is looking after whilst his or her mother works in a nearby coffee shop. What is certain, though, is that despite the fact we are separated from her by more than 145 years, there can be few people who can look at her and not feel moved by what they see. She is one of the outcast and downcast poor of the Victorian era, and she presents us with a stark reminder of the fate that befell those who, having fallen on hard times, often through no actual fault of their own, found themselves on a downward spiral into abject poverty and despair as they were left to fend for themselves as best they could. She is quite simply a lesson from the past. But who was she, and how did her image come to be preserved for posterity? Well, this lady is or was one of the subjects captured by the Victorian photographer John Thomson, a pioneer of the new photojournalism that was emerging at the time. In 1876, inspired by the success of Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, Thomson teamed up with the radical left-leaning journalist Adolphe, and they began publishing a monthly magazine called Street Life in London. Month after month their readers would, from the comfort of their armchairs and by the warmth of their firesides, be able to venture into the poorest quarters of London and view the inhabitants in their natural habitat. And no, I'm not being facetious here, for the poverty-stricken enclaves of the large Victorian towns and cities were coming to be seen in, and often referred to in, terms that are very much in keeping with our modern wildlife shows and magazines. In short, they were seen as places that intrepid explorers could venture into and then bring back photographic evidence of their encounters. John Thomson was very much at the forefront of this new medium, and in Street Life in London he and Smith sought to portray these harder phases of life, bringing to bear the precision of photography in illustration of our subject. As they put it in the preface to the first edition of the book version of their publication, we have selected our material in the highways and the byways, deeming that the familiar aspects of street life would be as welcome as those glimpses caught here and there at the angle of some dark alley or in some squalid corner beyond the beat of the ordinary wayfarer. At the same time, we have visited, armed with notebook and camera, those back streets and courts where the struggle for life is none the less bitter and intense because less observed. Here, what may be termed more original studies have presented themselves and will help to complete what we trust will provide a vivid account of the various means by which our unfortunate fellow creatures endeavour to earn, beg, or steal their daily bread. The two men shared the writing, Smith ultimately contributing 24 articles and Thomson 12 to their publication. The article about the lady on the step, however, was a joint feature that appeared in an episode titled The Crawlers. Her photograph was taken in Short's Gardens, located in St Giles, which at the time was one of the most poverty-stricken quarters of London. The step on which she was photographed was that of the workhouse, on the site of which the block of flats to the right now stands. Once John Thomson had taken the photograph of the lady, Adolphe Smith went to work interviewing her in order to learn something of her circumstances and a little about the crawlers in general. This is what he wrote. Huddled together on the workhouse steps in Short's Gardens, those wrecks of humanity, the crawlers of St Giles's, may be seen both day and night seeking mutual warmth and mutual consolation in their extreme misery. As a rule, they are old women reduced by vice and poverty to that degree of wretchedness which destroys even the energy to beg. They have not the strength to struggle for bread, and prefer starvation to the activity which an ordinary mendicant must display. As a natural consequence, they cannot obtain money for a lodging or for food. What little charity they receive is more frequently derived from the lowest orders. They beg from beggars, and the energetic, prosperous mendicant is in his turn called upon to give to those who are his inferiors in the profession. Stale bread, half-used tea leaves, and on gala days the fly-blown bone of a joint are their principal items of diet. A broken jug or a teapot without spout or handle constitutes the domestic crockery. In this, the stale tea leaves, or perhaps if one of the company has succeeded in begging a penny, a halfpenny worth of new tea is carefully placed. Then one of the women rises and crawls slowly towards Drury Lane, where there is a coffee shop keeper and also a publican who take compassion on these women and supply them gratuitously with boiling water. Warm tea is thus procured at a minimum cost, and the poor women's lives prolonged. But old age and want of proper food and rest reduces them to a lethargic condition which can scarcely be preferable to death itself. It will be noticed that they are constantly dozing, and yet are never really asleep. Some of them are unable to lie down for days. They sit on the hard stone step of the workhouse, their heads reclining on the door, and here, by old custom, they are left undisturbed. Indeed, the policeman on his beat displays, I am told, much commiseration for these poor refugees, and in no way molests them. When it rains, the door offers a little shelter if the wind is in a favourable direction, but as a rule the women are drenched, and consequently experience all the tortures of ague and rheumatism in addition to their other ailments. Under such circumstances, sound sleep is an unknown luxury, hence that drowsiness from which they are never thoroughly exempt. This peculiarity has earned them the nickname of dosses, derived from the verb to doze, by which they are sometimes recognized. The crawlers may truly be described as persons who sleep with one eye open. Those who seem in the soundest sleep will look up languidly on the approach of a stranger, as if they were always anticipating interference of some sort. Some of these crawlers are not, however, so devoid of energy as we might at first be led to infer. A few days' good lodging and good food might operate a marvellous transformation. The abject misery into which they are plunged is not always self-sought and merited, but is as often the result of unfortunate circumstances and accident. Having introduced his readers to the class of people to which the woman in the photograph belonged, Smith then went on to provide them with a biography of the woman herself and of the circumstances that had brought her to the step on which Thomson and Smith encountered her. The crawler, for instance, whose portrait is now before the reader, is the widow of a tailor who died some 10 years ago. She had been living with her son-in-law, a marble stone polisher by trade, who is now in difficulties through ill health. It appears, however, that at best he never cared much for his work, and innumerable quarrels ensued between him, his wife, his mother-in-law, and his brother-in-law, a youth of 15. At last, after many years of wrangling, the mother, finding that her presence aggravated her daughter's troubles, left this uncomfortable home, and with a young son descended penniless into the street. From that day she fell lower and lower, and now takes her seat among the crawlers of the district. Her young son is not only helpless, but troubled with unjustifiable pride. He has pawned his clothes, is covered with rags, but still scorns to sell matches in the street, and is accused of giving himself airs above his station. The woman, though once able to earn money as a tailoress, was obliged to abandon that style of working in consequence of her weak eyesight, and now her great ambition is to go out scrubbing. But who will employ, even for this menial purpose, a woman who has no home, no address to give, and sleeps on the workhouse steps when she cannot gain admittance into the casual ward? Her son, equally homeless and ragged, cannot, for the same reasons, hope to obtain work. But on the other hand, I convinced myself after a long conversation that this woman thoroughly realized her position and had a very clear idea as to what she should do to redeem herself. She would move heaven and earth to obtain a few shillings, and with these would proceed to the hop fields, where she would earn enough to save about £1, and £1, she urged, would be sufficient to start in life once more. Her son might get his clothes out of pawn, and then obtain work. She would, on her side, rent a little room so as to have an address, and then it would be possible for her to apply for work. Nor was this castle in the air beyond realization. A fellow crawler who used to doze on the same step leading to St Giles's workhouse had actually obtained employment in a coffee shop, and while awaiting an opportunity to follow this example, my informant was taking care of her friend's child. The infant appears in the photograph and is entrusted by its mother to the tender mercies of the crawler at about 10 o'clock every morning. The mother returns from work at 4 in the afternoon, but resumes her occupation at the coffee shop from 8 to 10 in the evening, when the infant is once more handed over to the crawler and kept out in the streets through all weathers, with no extra protection against the rain and sleet than the dirty and worn shawl which covers the poor woman's shoulders. But, as she explained, it pushes its little head under my chin when it is very cold and cuddles up to me so that it keeps me warm as well as itself. The child, however, cried and wheezed and coughed in a manner that did not testify to the success of this expedient, but it was a wonder that, under the conditions, the woman took care of the child at all. The only reward she receives for the 8 hours nursing per day devoted to the little urchin is a cup of tea and a little bread. Even this modest remuneration is not always forthcoming, and the crawler has often been compelled to content herself with bread without tea or tea without bread, so that even this, her principal and often her only meal per day, is not always to be had. And thus Adolphe Smith ends his description of the life and times of the woman whose photograph was destined to adorn the pages and covers of numerous books on poverty in 19th century London. She has found herself transported to many different parts of the metropolis when an author or photo editor is seeking an image that will convey the plight of the downcast poor of the Victorian era. She is a regular feature in television documentaries, and her image is, to say the least, one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic depictions of London street life in the second half of the 19th century. The one thing Adolphe Smith doesn't give us, however, is her name. Many of us are familiar with her image. We know as much about her as any of her confederates on the streets knew about her, and yet we haven't the faintest idea of who she was and what became of her. For myself, I hope that the coverage given to her plight in street life in London led some well-meaning Victorian lady or gentleman to track her down and provide her with a more comfortable existence in her final years. I hope that she got finally to rent that little room she dreamt of as she fought her daily battle for survival on the steps around Short's Gardens. Somehow I doubt it, but whatever became of her, may she rest in peace.